And this morning what we're going to do is look at a series of events in Jesus' ministry that we often read as sort of complete or individual stories on their own. And we did this a few weeks ago where we lined up a series of healing stories. And we saw how together they told one larger story of how Matthew is trying to point us toward God. Having come as Jesus, as Israel's shepherd, to gather and to heal and to care for his sheep. And so in the same way this morning, we're going to try to pay attention to the larger theme that Matthew is developing in his gospel, rather than focusing in only on the details of a single event. And so you'll see how this plays out when we think about an event like the feeding of the 5,000. An event that many of us have heard, we've read, we've heard sermons on, we've read devotionals on. This feeding of the 5,000 doesn't stand alone in Matthew's gospel as a unique miracle. Although it's often read and taught individually by itself as a story, a chapter later, Jesus is repeating this miracle, where he feeds a crowd of 4,000. And in both of these events, Jesus is said to have compassion on the crowd in front of him. In each case, he takes a small amount of bread and fish, and he gives thanks for them and breaks them and gives them so that all ate and all are satisfied. And in each feeding, or after each feeding, I should say, the disciples gather up baskets of leftovers. So these stories are remarkably similar. And when I read the Bible, sometimes when I think about the details of Jesus' life and ministry, the ones that I feel like got left out, right? It always makes me wonder, why would Matthew waste space on a second feeding? Right? I mean, it feels practically like the first. Why not cut this out? Give me some extra details about Jesus' childhood, maybe his bar mitzvah, or one of those like other interesting healings that basically just gets passed over. Why couldn't we get a little bit more detail there, right? Any number of places I feel like I could use bonus details, but I got a second feeding. And so what does this mean? Why are there two? What function do they play as a way of telling a story? Reading through Torah last year taught us that repeated events are not lazy storytelling, as much as it may feel that way. In fact, when events are repeated and they're almost the same but not exactly the same, this should actually catch our attention as a particular kind of storytelling. So last year, as we read Torah, we saw two sets of parallel events in the book of Exodus and then in the book of Numbers. In Exodus, Israel had just been set free from slavery, and they have a series of experiences with God in the wilderness as they flee to Mount Sinai. Then in the book of Numbers, as they're leaving Mount Sinai, they travel again through the wilderness and have a remarkably similar set of experiences with God as they travel to the promised land. And right between these two sets of similar events is God's central revelation of himself at Sinai. There he revealed himself to his people and he gave them instruction. From a storytelling perspective then, as we read the second set of parallel events, whether it's Numbers or whether it's the second feeding, the question that we ask is, how did Israel's meeting with God and his instructions change them? How did it change their attitudes? How did it change their behaviors? And so this is the kind of story that Matthew is telling us about the disciples. And so we'll take a look together. Beginning in chapter 14, we'll start at verse 13. Jesus has just received word that John the Baptizer has been killed by Herod. The first of the preachers of the kingdom of heaven is now dead. And we read, "Now when Jesus heard this, he he withdrew from there in a boat to a desolate place by himself. But when the crowds heard it, they followed him on foot from the towns. When he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion on them, and he healed their sick. Now, when it was evening, the disciples came to him and said, "This is a desolate place, and the day is now over. Send the crowds away to the villages so that they can buy food for themselves." But Jesus said, "They need not go away. You give them something to eat." And they said to him, "We only have 5 loaves here and 2 fish." Then he ordered the crowds to sit down on the grass, and taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and said a blessing. Then he broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the crowds, and they all ate and were all satisfied. And they took up 12 baskets full of broken pieces left over. And those who ate were about 5,000 men, besides women and children. This is the first time in the Gospel of Matthew that we've heard Matthew speak of Jesus having compassion. That is, since the end of chapter 9. The end of chapter 9, we read that Jesus saw the crowds and he had compassion for them because they were harassed and helpless like sheep without a shepherd. For 2 chapters leading up until that point, Matthew had told us a story of Jesus cleansing a leper, healing a Gentile soldier servant, healing Peter's mother-in-law, and so on, healing after healing. It was Jesus' words, it was Jesus' garment, it was Jesus' touch that brought about God's healing power into people's lives. Jesus was their shepherd, and he had compassion on them. And then he said to his disciples, "The harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. Therefore, pray earnestly to the Lord of the harvest to send out laborers into his harvest." And we never find the disciples praying this prayer. We don't know if they prayed it or not, but Jesus answers it. In chapter 10, Jesus gave the disciples instructions for going out. He sends them out as his laborers. He warned them. And he taught them. He showed them what they would face if they stuck with him. He gave them increased understanding. And we come now to chapter 14. For the very first time, Jesus in the Gospel of Matthew gives his disciples work to do. Up till this point, they've largely been spectators, listeners, learners, along for the ride. But now Jesus gives them something to do. He puts food in their hands and he says, "Feed these people." In a perfect picture of the kingdom in action, the disciples see a need and they come to Jesus with an idea about how they might meet it. This is a desolate place. The day is over and the people need to eat. Jesus tells them to feed the people. Matthew has already established for us that Jesus is the one who is the shepherd of these sheep. But Jesus is empowering these disciples to do the work of a shepherd, to feed the flock. But the disciples have a problem with this, right? Because they are immediately able to recognize that they lack the resources to do what Jesus has called them to do. Food is scarce in this place, and they don't have enough to make up the difference. 5 loaves and 2 fish isn't even enough for 12 disciples to eat, let alone a crowd, right? It's hard to know for sure what motivates the disciples here, but it could be that perhaps they didn't have enough to eat themselves, and so they're coming to Jesus that, hey, maybe we should send people along to get food is actually a little bit more self-interested. Hey, maybe we should go get food because we don't have it either. But Jesus is unfazed. He takes the little that they have, and through his disciples, Jesus more than meets the need of 5,000 men, not counting women or children. And all ate and were satisfied, and there were 12 baskets left over. Every time I read the end of that event, I immediately think of a young, poor Moabite woman named Ruth, who found a field to glean in, where she could gather food for herself and for her mother-in-law so that they wouldn't starve to death. And when the master of that field showed up, he saw her working in his field, and he told his laborers to protect her and to provide for her. And then at mealtime, the Lord of the harvest invited Ruth to eat with him and to eat with his laborers. And as the book of Ruth tells us, there she ate until she was satisfied, and she had some left over. The book of Ruth, a short 4 chapters, tells the story of a generous landowner named Boaz, who is unfazed by scarcity. Israel had undergone a famine so severe that Israelites, God's people, felt the need to flee from the promised land that God had given to them to enemy regions just to find food, just to survive. The famine had recently come to an end, and people had begun to come back, but there were many poor in Israel at this time. And this was also a time when everyone was doing what was right in their own eyes. And yet there was a mighty man named Boaz who was busy demonstrating the kind of compassion and love for neighbor that Israel's law was intended to create. If we know anything about people who have experienced famine or severe economic depression, their first instinct after getting back on their feet is generally not to give generously. It is to hoard. It is to save. It is to scrimp. It is to guard against the possibility of any future financial failure. In a desolate place, the disciples can see the physical needs. Whether they see the crowd's needs or they see their own, it doesn't matter, because what they also see is scarcity. Scarcity of resources and the inability to see any solution except the people being sent off to deal with those needs on their own. But Jesus shows them that he is unfazed by scarcity. This is the very first time that we see the disciples in action in Matthew's gospel, and so we shouldn't expect too much of them. This discipleship thing takes time. It takes messing up. It takes learning. It takes not understanding so that we might move toward understanding. It takes learning. And here we get a sort of baseline for the disciples in action. We want to watch now, how do they change as the story progresses? Do they change at all? In verse 22, the next event begins with the disciples jumping into a boat, and they begin to cross to the other side of the Sea of Galilee. And the disciples leave ahead of Jesus. Jesus stays back to dismiss the crowd and then to get away to pray. And in the middle of the night, Jesus catches up with the disciples. The disciples are in the middle of the lake, by the way, right? He doesn't have a speedboat. He uses his legs. In the book of Job, Job declares that it is God alone who walks on the waves of the sea. Matthew tells us that in the midst of wind and waves, Jesus walks on the sea. Well, the Gospel of Mark also records this event. Matthew is the only gospel writer who seems interested in Peter. Peter asks Jesus to command him to come out onto the water. Peter wants to join him because of course he does. He's Peter. So Jesus calls, "Come." And Peter gets out of the boat and he walks on water. And he saw the wind and he was afraid and he started to sink. And when Jesus took hold of him, he said to Peter, "Oh, you of little trust. Why did you doubt?" Up till this point in Matthew, Jesus has said, "Oh, you of little trust," 2 times. The first time, he said it as part of the Sermon on the Mount, telling his listeners, "Do not be anxious about your lives. Don't worry about where your food will come from. Aren't you more valuable to your Father in heaven than the birds of the air that he feeds?" In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus claimed that scarcity is a terrible reason for lacking trust. If it is food or drink that feels scarce, clothes or health, time or shelter, these are the things that Gentiles worry about, Jesus says. But you who have the scriptures, you who have in your possession the stories of God's constant, generous provision, you ought to trust your Father in heaven. The second time that Jesus uses this phrase, or used it, was when the disciples feared for their lives on a sea, or in a boat, in a storm on the sea. So food and seas, the feeding of the 5,000 and walking on water. Can you see the story that's sort of being retold now as the disciples are in action? And we'll say a little bit more about Peter walking on water, but for now, we move to the center of our passage this morning, where Jesus teaches. In chapter 15, Jesus is confronted by Pharisees and scribes who want to challenge Jesus on his disciples' behavior. But Jesus turns the situation around. God's law commands that God's people care for the needs of their aging parents. This was a time when there was no Social Security. There was no retirement. There was only your children to care for you. But the Jewish people had developed a tradition that said, you can be excused from caring for your aging parents by giving to God in some other way. In other words, from an argument of scarcity, the Jewish people developed a tradition that said this: we only have limited resources, right? You look at what you have, and this is what we have. If I am going to give any of my resources away, I ought to give to God first. Sorry, parents. Except God desires mercy, not sacrifice. In other words, when you extend mercy to someone, when you welcome a stranger into your home, when you feed an orphan, when you support your aging parents, you honor God and you worship him in a way that is perhaps more meaningful than what you might have brought to the temple. It's not that you are refusing to sacrifice. You are choosing, in this case, to give something of great value, but you are doing it for the sake of a neighbor as an act of love toward your neighbor and for God. Giving at the temple or giving in a ceremonial kind of way easily becomes a way of avoiding the marginalized people in our society who we've been called to come and to be among and to extend compassion to in some way. Jesus goes further. It isn't just about the Pharisees, and it isn't just about their empty acts of worship. Jesus criticizes their entire view of the world. In verse 10, we hear Jesus as he calls the people to come around him, and he says to them, hear and understand this. It is not what goes into the mouth that defiles a person, but what comes out of their mouth. This defiles a person. It is of utmost importance that we understand, we recognize how earth-shattering these words are in Jesus' context. It is though someone walks into a room 700 years ago and says, the sun doesn't revolve around the earth revolves around the sun. Mind blown, right? I mean, think of some of the things that you hold most basic about the way that the world works. Somebody walks in and says, nope, it's a different way. This is what's happening here. And this announcement that food doesn't defile has only one real effect, and it's an expected one. Because the disciples come to Jesus and they say, do you know that the Pharisees were offended by what you said? Of course they were. Jesus is calling into question one of their most fundamental beliefs. Because God had given Israel their dietary laws. We read about all of these sweet, wonderful restrictions last year as we worked our way through Leviticus. These dietary instructions were one of several markers that would make Israel distinct in the world. One part of making Israel distinct was that Israel's distinctiveness would attract the attention of Israel's neighbors so that they might, with some degree of curiosity, come and find a place among the Israelites to seek and know and worship the God of Israel. But some years down the line, Israel is destroyed. Israel goes away into exile. They experience a complete loss of everything they have, land and temple and kingdom. Israel even describes a sense of having felt abandoned entirely by God himself. As more time passes and Israel regains its former self, returning to the land, rebuilding the temple, it's in that context that Israel's dietary laws begin to take on a new purpose. They begin to change. Rather than serve as a distinctive marker, attracting their neighbors, Israel begins to pervert these dietary laws so that they become a way to exclude not only their neighbors, but even fellow Israelites. Dietary laws become a way of determining who is welcome and who wasn't. They functioned as a fence, separating the righteous from the unrighteous. And this is generally what we do in the world when we experience the world as a place defined by scarcity. We put fences around our homes because when our houses are so close to each other, our privacy is limited. We put fences around our fields, if we have fields, because we don't want our neighbors' cows to eat our limited grass. We put fences around our country because we don't want our neighbors coming over to take our limited jobs and our limited health care and our limited Social Security. But our fences are not just literal fences. They're often categories that we use to decide if someone is deserving of our money or not. They're categories that we use to determine which people deserve our time and which people don't. These are the categories that we use to determine who belongs in church and who doesn't. When resources, whether time, money, housing, medical, or whatever, are limited, or at least we feel as though they are limited because as we look at what's available to us in front of what we can see with our eyes, they look very limited. We have a tendency to create artificial barriers that divide the worthy and the welcome from the unworthy and the unwelcome. And here is where it gets especially dangerous. We baptize our boundaries. We announce that God himself has given us these distinctions, and we push people away and we spiritualize our lack of compassion. We claim that we are just worshiping and honoring God, when what we are really doing is refusing to love God by refusing to love our neighbors. It shouldn't surprise us that Peter, in the middle of this conversation, asks Jesus to explain himself, to which Jesus follows up, "Are you still not understanding?" In the next two events following this teaching, we see that the disciples don't understand yet. The disciples are still operating as though the sun revolves around the earth. It takes time to change your conception of how the world works. And so the very next event, they encounter a Canaanite woman. And when she cries out for mercy, they beg Jesus to send her away, for she's crying out after us. You can hear the disciples. She's so annoying. She won't stop following us. She won't stop crying. And this is the only reference in the entire New Testament to a Canaanite person. And we're immediately struck by what a Canaanite represents. Canaanites were Israel's mortal enemies in their earliest years. I don't know who, when you think of the world, who you sort of imagine as being the sort of worst of all kinds of people. But that's who this woman represents. She is the worst. Not just an outsider, but she's irredeemably wicked by nature, by ethnicity. At least according to the boundaries that the Pharisees and the scribes have created and baptized. The irony, of course, about this encounter is that the disciples are frustrated with the woman for crying out to Jesus for help, while the disciples were just heard crying out as well, not for help, but in fear, because as Jesus approached them, they didn't even recognize him. And Jesus himself affirms that this woman greatly trusts him and trusts his abilities, and essentially becomes, in this entire 2-chapter stretch, the only model of trusting faith in this entire section. And the disciples would try to keep her away. And then finally, we move to the second feeding. This time, it's the 4,000. And we wonder, will the disciples be any different, having encountered Jesus and his teaching and seeing him praise the Canaanite woman for her trust? And apart from the numbers of people and loaves and baskets, there really are only 2 distinct differences that this story has compared to the one of the 5,000. First, it's the crowd. The Gospel of Mark makes a huge deal that this feeding happens in Gentile territory, but Matthew doesn't seem to care where it happens. For Matthew, his emphasis is on who is here. And so he gives us a list: the lame, the blind, the crippled, the mute, and many others. Don't you love those sort of summary passages of the Bible where you can just use your imagination? And a lot of other people, right? But these are the unvalued members of society. And so whoever else you can add to the many others list of unvalued members of society, throw them in there. These are the ones who, value speaking, we already know are going to live shorter lives. So are they really worth the resources? It's already generally assumed that they have these ailments because of some sort of sin or disobedience in their lives or their family's life. And so again, how much honor could these people have? How deserving are they of our time, our attention? These are the ones who are so easily pushed to the margins of society. And I think it matters that this is who makes up the crowd, because the other major difference in this story from the other story is how the feeding gets started. Here in the second feeding, it's not the disciples who come to Jesus having seen a need, but it is Jesus who calls the disciples to him. And it's not at the end of a day, but it's at the end of 3 days. One gets the sense that the disciples, for 3 days, have been feeding on the leftovers from the previous feeding. Because it's at the end of 3 days that they have 7 loaves of bread left. And up till this point, they haven't been hungry, and so haven't found a strong enough reason to come to Jesus and say, hey, it might be time to get some food. And they don't or can't see the need. They can't see the hunger of the people in front of them. Ultimately, the thing that Jesus says about this group that he doesn't say about the other group is that I'm concerned that for them to leave, they would faint, that they literally haven't eaten in 3 days. And once again, when called upon by Jesus, the disciples are paralyzed by scarcity. They cannot see beyond what is lacking. And they ask Jesus, how are we supposed to feed this crowd? And Jesus again takes what they have, and all ate, and all were satisfied, and there were baskets left over. In the verses that follow this feeding, Jesus warns the disciples about the teaching of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Jesus knows that their teaching emerges from a place of fear. Their teaching comes from a fundamental anxiety about God's ability to provide. their boundaries, deny God's abundance, and instead cling to the idea that resources are truly scarce. The beauty then of this in this passage is that in the midst of disciples and Pharisees who lack understanding, who can only see what they don't have, there is a Canaanite woman who gets it. She trusts the word that she's received from somewhere, that Jesus is the Son of David, and she clings to that truth, and she comes to Jesus as though he truly is the Son of David, which is the only way one might, which is humbly, calling him Lord. She worships him, and she understands that even the smallest gift from God, what she calls a crumb from the table of God's children, that even that is enough to satisfy. See, in her world, scarcity is not a problem to manage, but it's an opportunity to trust the God of Israel. And so, in what ways do we live out of fear that resources are scarce? Do we reject the kingdom compassion of Jesus because we are paralyzed by what we do not have, by scarcity? Or, like the Canaanite woman, are we humbly and joyfully able to receive and then give whatever God allows us to have, as small as that crumb might be?